Monogenes does not mean begotten. The word ordinarily means of a single kind, and as a result, unique is a good translation. That's the reason why you sometimes find a translation that renders the word only begotten. It has to do with an ancient heresy within the church. In response to the Arian claim that Jesus was made not begotten, Jerome translated the Greek term monogenes into Latin as unigetus, only begotten. So there is absolutely nothing. In fact, we'll deal with the issue of Son of God later on. But before we can come to that, look at this quotation in John 20:18, 16 to 18. When Jesus appeared before Mary Magdalene in the after the so-called post-crucifixion appearances, and she goes and wants to cling on to him. What does Jesus say? He says, I am ascending to my Father and to your Father, to my God and your God. And then Mary Magdalene went and conveyed that particular message to Jesus in respect of that particular point. So with all the discussions that Dr. Craig has given us, he has not been able to basically give us a single point which illustrates that Jesus claimed to be God, or where he said that he is divine or commands people to worship him. Of course, you'd find passages in the New Testament which purport to suggest that, but that's not the case. In respect of the issue pertaining to the parable of the wicked tenants and the other so-called discussions, I will deal in the rebuttal section, so it does not mean that I concede that point. It's interesting to note that the New Testament that we have it today is an eclectic edition. It's a development which is recognized by the vast majority of biblical scholars. You've got the oldest manuscript, the Codex Sinaiticus, dates to when? 400 years after Jesus. And you found that when Constantine von Tischendorf discovered the Sinaiticus, he discovered something like 14,800 editorial alterations when compared to the existing New Testament in the 19th century. So these are points of note. It's not scholarly to say or speak about multiple attestations when we don't even have the original words of Jesus amongst us. We don't even have the original words of Jesus. Jesus never spoke Greek, he spoke Aramaic. I'd like to end with one particular quotation from a particular scholar on this point, and I see I've just got 1 minute left. And he says that, this is Charles Kammer in his book Ethics and Liberation. He says, and this is the message I leave for all of you, Muslims as well as Christians. If we are truly to honor and respect the person of Jesus and live out the implications of his life, death, and teachings, we can no longer make claims about the absolute uniqueness of Jesus or the necessity of the encounter with the person of Jesus for human liberation and salvation. To be true to the person of Jesus, his life, love, and concern for others, his openness to persons of both sexes and all economic classes, all cultural backgrounds, we must repudiate a Christology. We must repudiate a Christology that measures the worth of persons on the basis of their relationship with Christ alone. I thank you for that time. With all the discussions that Dr. Craig has had, unfortunately he has not proven the point, and I'd be interested in hearing the rebuttal. I'd like to end with a verse of the Quran which says, وَقُلْ جَاءَ الْحَقُّ وَزَهَقَ الْبَاطِلُ إِنَّ الْبَاطِلَ كَانَ زَهُوقًا. That when truth comes and throws itself against that which is incorrect is bound to fall away. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and God bless you.
Thank you, Dr. Craig, and thank you, Mr. Ismael. Now we come to our first rebuttals, one from each lead debater. And I just want to remind the debaters that the purpose of a rebuttal is primarily to deal with matters which have already been raised by the other side, not to introduce new material. Unfortunately, we haven't got all night, and we need, therefore, to be succinct and concise. Over to Dr. Craig for his first rebuttal.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ismael, for those very interesting comments. I very much enjoyed listening to that speech and am glad for the interaction. Please. Now, before I review the case that I presented in my opening speech, let me comment on a number of remarks that Mr. Ismael made. First, he said that the deity of Christ was the result of the declaration of certain councils in the 4th and 5th centuries, like the Council of Nicaea. This is a gross misimpression historically. What the councils merely did was codify what the church had already believed from the beginning. Indeed, in many cases, there were heretics that were denying the humanity of Christ that needed to be countered. So the real issue is not what the council said, it's what's in the New Testament, and in particular what Jesus believed about himself. Now, Mr. Ismael then says that the classical Orthodox doctrine of one person with two natures is illogical, paradoxical, incoherent. You can't have it both ways. Give me a model, he says, of the incarnation. Well, those are excellent questions, and in fact, I have done just that in my book, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, in which I lay out a model of the incarnation according to which the second person of the Trinity takes on a human nature in addition to the divine nature he already had, so that he has a full complement of human properties as well as a full complement of divine properties, and is therefore truly both God and man. Now, he asks, was Jesus aware of his divinity? On the model I suggest, you divide the consciousness of Christ into layers, both a subliminal and a conscious level of consciousness. And I think as a baby, certainly Jesus wasn't aware of everything that he knew in his divine nature. You don't have the monstrosity of the little baby lying in the manger thinking about the infinitesimal calculus or New Testament theology. Rather, he grew in wisdom and stature as he grew older. By the age of 12, we know that he already had a sense of his divine sonship, because in the temple visit, when his parents lost him, he said, "Didn't you know I must be about my Father's business?" And by the time his ministry began, as we saw in my opening speech, he had a clear sense of his divine self-consciousness as the unique Son of God. Mr. Ismael says, well, can you have a man who is both a fat man and a thin man? Well, if that man has two natures, yes, you can. Let me give an illustration. How many of you have seen the movie Avatar? How many have seen the movie Avatar? Okay, a few at least. An avatar is another name for incarnation. And this movie tells the story of Jake Sully, who is a disabled Marine who becomes an avatar among a race of extraterrestrials called the Na'vi. Now, Jake Sully is physically disabled, yet he becomes physically incarnated among them as a Na'vi. At the same time, however, he doesn't cease to be human. So Jake has both a human nature and a Na'vi nature. And these two natures have strikingly different properties. If you were to say, can Jake Sully run? The answer would be, well, yes and no. He cannot run as a human being in his human nature, but certainly in his Na'vi nature, he can run. Now, if you can make sense of Avatar, then you can make sense of Christ's incarnation. Because in exactly the same way, Christ has both a divine nature and a human nature. And these two natures have different powers. In his human nature, Christ experienced all of the limitations intrinsic to humanity. But in his divine nature, he had supernatural powers. Just as Jake Sully, in his Na'vi nature, became the savior of the Na'vi people, so Christ in his human nature becomes the savior of humankind. So I think this model makes perfect sense of the incarnation, and there's nothing logical or incoherent about it. Now, he asks what theologians or New Testament scholars today think that Jesus was divine. Well, James D.G. Dunn, whom he quoted, N.T. Wright, John Meyer, Martin Hengel, Wolfhard Pannenbeck, Peter Stuhlmacher, Gerald O'Collins. I could go on and on. There are plenty who agree with the divinity of Jesus. In fact, he said, where does the Bible refer to Jesus as God? Well, I would refer to him, Murray J. Harris's book, Jesus as God, where he points out 9 times where Jesus is called God in the New Testament. Now, what's significant about that is that Jesus didn't go around saying, I am God, as Mr. Ismael would demand, because God, in the Jewish context, typically referred to the Father. And so Jesus doesn't want to say, I am the Father. But what he does do is he calls himself the unique Son of God who transcends all human persons. He is the divine human Son of Man prophesied by the prophet Daniel, which are claims that in a Muslim view would be, frankly, blasphemous for claiming to be divine in that way. But sometimes the New Testament writers, as I say, lose all sense of inhibition, and on at least 9 occasions do overtly refer to Jesus as God, ha theos in the Greek. The most important claim, however, is what Jesus believed about himself. And I propose several criteria of authenticity, which significantly Mr. Ismael accepts. Now, if you accept those criteria of authenticity, the claims of Jesus that I gave all meet those criteria of authenticity. So you cannot deny that Jesus made them. And that puts the Muslim in a very awkward position, because Muslims believe Jesus is a prophet, a great prophet, and therefore spoke the truth. But if he spoke the truth, you've got to believe what he said. And he said that he was the unique Son of God, different from all of the prophets, God's final messenger, the divine human Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, and God raised him from the dead in attestation of that fact. Now, Mr. Ismael responds at this point, but the text of the New Testament is hopelessly corrupt. This, frankly, my friends, is a desperate gambit by Mr. Ismael. The New Testament is the best attested book in ancient history, both in terms of the number of manuscripts and in terms of the nearness of those manuscripts to the time it was originally written. Out of the 138,000 words in the Greek New Testament, only about 1,400, that's around 1%, are still somewhat in doubt, and even those are utterly trivial, like the difference between your and our. Bart Ehrman himself says textual criticism can get back pretty much to what the authors originally said. So that the New Testament, as you read it today in Greek, you can be confident with 99% accuracy that you are reading the very words that Paul or Luke or Matthew wrote. And to suggest otherwise is simply ignorance. Now, Mr. Ismael makes a great deal of the fact that the synoptics change in their statements of Jesus, that John is different from the synoptics. But all that's irrelevant to tonight's debate, because we're not debating the question of biblical inerrancy. I'm staking my claim upon certain specific claims of Jesus that pass the criteria of authenticity. And these are not drawn from John or the later synoptics. They are drawn from Mark, and they are drawn from Q, the source used by Matthew and Luke prior to those Gospels. So that I'm appealing to some of the earliest sources behind the New Testament. Let's look quickly at some of those claims. First, Jesus' radical self-concept as the divine Son of Man. Now, he points out that in Job, the scripture says the Son of Man is a maggot. But the point is that when you look at Jesus' statement, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and glory. That is virtually a quotation out of Daniel 7. It's not a reference to Job. Jesus is claiming here to be the prophesied Son of Man, to whom all dominion and authority will be given. What about his claims to be the unique Son of God? I shared the parable of the vineyard. He says, Jimmy Dunn says that there is later developments in the synoptics, but so far as I know, Jimmy Dunn accepts the authenticity of the parable of the wicked tenants of the vineyard. If he thinks otherwise, I'd like to see him show me a statement of Dunn from his recent book, Jesus Remembered, that suggests that. Mr. Ismael also misrepresents Raymond Brown in saying that the later creedal statements about Jesus represent a development. Certainly those do represent a development of theological reflection, but that does nothing to suggest that this is not an authentic parable uttered by Jesus of Nazareth, in which he distinguishes himself from all the prophets and says he is God's only beloved Son. We also saw in Matthew 11:27, Jesus claims to be the Son of God and the only revelation of God to mankind. And then on the saying on the date of his return, we saw again that he claims to be higher than men, than all the angels. He's in proximity to the Father. He says in the Quran, it says man is higher than the angels because of free will. But that's not relevant. The question isn't what the Quran means. The question is, what did Jesus of Nazareth mean? And he's contrasting himself with men who already have free will, as well as with angels, and saying that he is in proximity to the Father and is the absolute revelation of the Father. The trial and crucifixion, we heard nothing from Mr. Ismael yet on that. I grant that doesn't mean he concedes the point, but it has yet to be refuted. And finally, the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. Most scholars today, on the basis of the criteria of authenticity, accept Jesus' burial, the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. So I think we've got very good grounds, solid grounds historically, for thinking that God raised Jesus from the dead and thereby vindicated and authenticated those allegedly blasphemous claims for which he was crucified. All of this is in contrast to the Muslim view, which is relying upon a document 600 years after the fact, written by a man living in Arabia who had no independent historical source of information about the historical Jesus. I think it's very clear where the historically reliable portrait of Jesus is to be found. It's in those primary source documents that are contained in the New Testament. So I would say that the pastor had better get the baptismal font ready because I think we have every good reason to affirm the radical self-concept of Jesus as evident in the authentic sayings of Jesus in the New Testament, and we have good reason to believe that those claims are true in light of his miraculous resurrection from the dead.
Thank you for that, Dr. Craig, and thank you for that highlighting the movie Avatar. It's quite interesting that in Avatar, Jake Sully basically has two bodies, yet the belief in Christian theology is that you have three persons manifest in one divine being. In the case of Jake Sully, he had his avatar body and he had his personal body, and in the end, his actual bodies existed when they ended up burying the real body of Jake Sully when he gave it up. So that's not the same in terms of Christian theology. It's interesting that Avatar, according to James Cameron, he said he found his inspiration from Hinduism. He found his inspiration from Hinduism. I find that quite remarkable. Coming to the point of about Jesus making himself or making the claim that he was a divine son. But before I deal with that, it's quite interesting to note that Dr. Craig has not given us a model yet in terms of which he can illustrate that basically Jesus has two particular models. He hasn't even answered the question that when he died, if he believed in human faith, in God's power to raise himself, or on the other hand, did he face death with the infallible divine knowledge that he would be resurrected? Which was it? Because if the divine nature knew something that he did not, then we are back to two persons. Muslims would say that Jesus never committed blasphemy. And I do not have to be proved to a skeptic that the Jesus of the Quran is true. It's quite interesting that even though Dr. Craig has raised the issue of the 600 years later, he says, look, it's a bland type of Jesus that is presented, but you can find no particular exception. The Jesus of the Bible, on the other hand, the apologetic of Dr. Craig, and that offered by many apologists, is that the resurrection is presented as a solution to a particular problem. Now, following what Dr. Craig said, if Jesus made these particular radical claims that he was the Son of God in the divine sense, such that C.S. Lewis would say that you would have to choose between declaring him as a Son of God or declaring him as a liar. If Jesus made those blasphemous claims, and following that, Jesus was crucified as a blasphemer. And so it stands to reason that without assuming the resurrection, all we have until we experience the resurrection or proofs of the resurrection is that Jesus died as a blasphemer. Because Dr. Craig admits it. He can't come now and say, well, look, he never made these blasphemous claims, because then he would be going against what Galatians 3:13 states, that Jesus died as a curse. So in other words, if he died as a blasphemer, then there would be no reasons for the disciples of Jesus to believe him at that particular point if he was crucified for blasphemy. The only reason they could turn around is that Jesus apparently reappeared from the dead. So from where I stand then, it seems that I would be in the same position as the disciples of Jesus. Unless he reappears to me, I would have every particular reason to think that he's a blasphemer. But I don't think so, because the Quran, of course, testifies that it's true. I believe in the Quran and I believe in Jesus. But if I put away the Quran and I turn to the Bible, I would come to the crucifixion, which would prove to me that Jesus was a false pretender. Now, unless we have good reasons for thinking that Jesus would want to resurrect from the dead, or God would want to raise Jesus from the dead, Are there any good reasons for thinking that God would want to raise Jesus from the dead? Firstly, why would God want to raise a blasphemer from the dead? And in order to maintain that God raised him from the dead, you can only assume it, you cannot prove it. And so in a circular bit of reasoning, we can only know that Jesus was true if God were to raise him from the dead. And God can only raise him from the dead if he were true. But you, Dr. Craig, would say that he died as a blasphemer. So in that case, why would God want to raise him from the dead? In order to vindicate the claims of a blasphemer? That would be theologically impossible according to all kinds of Christian theology. Regarding the parable of the wicked tenants, which Dr. Craig had referred to, it's interesting to note that in this parable, when you analyze the particular story, you will notice how foolish was the behavior of the owner of the vineyard. He sent his servants one after another, and knowing that they were beaten and killed, nevertheless he sent his beloved son to the same danger. Although he had full power to act, he did nothing until his son is definitely killed. He's also ignorant of the future, because in this parable he naively assumes that the wicked servant will respect his son. So can one now compare that foolish man to God? But that is what the entire story does. That's why it's admitted in the Pelican New Testament commentaries of St. Mark, page 309, that it is unlikely that Jesus told this particular parable. Secondly, if you look at Jesus mentioned clearly being the heir of the vineyard, that's the thoughts and the very words of the tenant, not the owner, God. And therefore, Dr. Craig's beliefs are basically accurately matching their beliefs, not God's words. Besides that, a man can send his son because he's expecting that the tenants will respect him, but not necessarily that he is his only son. And exactly what the owner did not mention, but he did not say, my only son. Regarding the issue about that Dr. Craig raised, about the facts pertain to the Jesus being close to God, it's interesting to note that in Islam a believer is higher than angels and a non-believer is lower than animals, simply because angels have no desires pushing them to sin, and it's in their nature to always be obedient. And so an obedient human is better than the angels. At the same time, animals have no intellect to utilize like humans, so it's normal to be uncontrollable on their particular desires. I see no particular problem in respect of that. Dr. Craig made mention quite significantly of the resurrection. It's interesting to note that you can point out no less than 41 contradictions in the resurrection accounts alone. It's also interesting to note that the earliest source to mention the appearance of Jesus is Paul. He says, for example, in the book of Corinthians, for I delivered you unto first of all, which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was seen of Cephas, then of the 12, then he was seen of about the 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain unto this present. Jesus appeared unto the 12. Which 12 did Jesus appear to, Dr. Craig? Because at that particular point in time, Judas Iscariot was long dead. There were only 11 left, and Matthias was chosen at a little later point in time. Paul had no personal knowledge, and he's delivering first of all what he received at Jerusalem from James and Peter. And so the list of appearances seem to be in chronological order, for the words after that suggested, but it's noteworthy to mention that Paul does not mention any appearance to Mary Magdalene or any other woman, nor does he mention the appearance to Ananias. Now the point is that Paul would not have omitted to mention this proof in support of the fact of resurrection if he had known of it, for